Welcome to Brain Levat. We are delighted to be joined by Bradley Hillier-Smith, and we're going to be talking about the state's obligations to refugees. Bradley, would you like to start with a real-life case?
So this is a real life case, and it concerns the partial clearance and destruction of part of the Calais refugee camp in northern France by the French authorities in 2016. Now, I witnessed this event myself personally with my own eyes. And so, for those viewers and listeners who might not be aware, there was an informal refugee camp in northern France, in Calais, inhabited by about 10,000 refugees, including hundreds of unaccompanied refugee children who were trying to seek safety in the UK. Now, in February 2016, the French authorities decided to clear the southern portion of the camp. And what I saw during that clearance of that portion of the camp had a profound effect on me. So hundreds of riot police entered the camp and destroyed refugee settlements and ripped refugees from their settlements, used batons to beat refugees and drag them from their settlements. I saw one refugee visibly attempt to try and commit suicide to prevent himself being taken away. The police used rubber bullets to disperse the refugees, as well as tear gas, including against women and children. And for those of you who haven't been tear gassed, the pain is debilitating. And I recall me and other volunteers scrambling around to try and find distilled water to treat this young refugee girl who had tear gas in her eyes. As a result of the eviction of the southern part of the camp, over 100 unaccompanied refugee children went missing, and families were separated, and a few refugees sewed their mouths shut and went on hunger strike in protest against the maltreatment by the French authorities. But their demands were not met, and eventually later in 2016, the rest of the camp was cleared. Now, I raised this case for a number of reasons. One reason is to just explain my motivation for writing my latest book, which is The Ethics of State Responses to Refugees. So what I saw struck me as profoundly morally wrong, what I took to be serious abuses, violence, and human rights violations against innocent refugees who are merely seeking safety. And this was happening in 21st century Western Europe. And it struck me that there must be an alternative way to treat refugees and to understand, well, what would an ethical response to refugees be? And so I wanted to find that out. I wanted to find out, well, what are the specific moral obligations that states have towards these refugees? And these obligations, once we found them out, would constitute the elements of an ethical response. So that's what I set out to do. I mentioned the case as well because I think the case illuminates certain morally significant facts about the situation of contemporary refugees that have been overlooked in philosophical approaches to obligations towards refugees, but which I think are essential in understanding obligations towards them. So the first significant fact that I think the case illuminates is that, well, northern states, that is states in the global north, including the US, UK, European states, Australia, and so forth, these states are not merely innocent bystanders overlooking the harms that refugees are subjected to whilst they're displaced. And they're not disconnected from these harms. Instead, these states actively adopt a variety of policies and practices in response to refugees seeking safety, including border violence, such as that we discussed in the case in Calais, forced detention of refugees, forced encampment of refugees, and forced containment of refugees. Now, these policies and practices result in extensive mental and physical suffering for refugees, as well as human rights violations. And I think focusing on this fact helps us to understand states' negative duties towards refugees, that is, duties not to harm or otherwise violate the rights of innocent refugees. And I think understanding these negative duties is fundamental towards understanding an ethical response, and that understanding those negative duties represents the focus of the first half of my book. And the second morally significant fact that I think the case in Calais illuminates is the refugees are suffering as a result of extensive human rights violations, both in the causes of their displacement, that is, as they are forced to leave their own states of origin, but also whilst they're displaced, whilst they're trying to seek safety elsewhere. And they're subjected to these violations without protection or any recourse. And I think this is an interesting phenomenon. It's as if these refugees, for example, those refugees in Calais, had no human rights at all. Their human rights were essentially meaningless, did not offer them any protection. They were subjected to abuses regardless. And I think the fact that refugees are subjected to human rights violations has significant implications for understanding states' positive obligations towards refugees, because these human rights violations involve distinctive harms to refugees, and also the fact that they don't seem to have the capabilities to enjoy their human rights entails certain positive duties to secure their human rights such that they're able to enjoy and actually have those human rights be meaningful and substantive for them. So I think understanding this fact is crucial to understanding states' positive obligations towards refugees. And so the thought is, by looking at these morally significant facts, the fact that states in the global north are not merely innocent bystanders, and the fact that refugees are suffering as a result of human rights violations, help us understand both the negative and the positive duties that states owe to refugees. And the thought is that we need an understanding of both of these negative and positive duties to understand what an ethical response to refugees would be.
So I think it's a strong case. I want to ask you about negative duties towards refugees. So that would be the easier argument to go through. It seems like when you have a refugee camp, you don't want to walk in and cause enormous suffering to those in that camp. It seems like you do have some duties not to cause harm. A question though, do a lot of those negative duty violations happen because countries let refugees in the first place? So if there were no camps, if there were no refugee camps, if there were no settlement camps within the country, if it was just an ironclad border, a fence that didn't allow anyone in at all, would that eliminate many, if not all, of the harms that those refugees suffered as a result, direct result of that state's interventions?
Right. I think that's a good question. So I don't think these negative duties are only engaged once refugees are within the territories. I think these negative duties are engaged when we look at the certain policies and practices that states use to try and prevent and deter refugees from arriving in the first place. Now, these constitute violations of negative duties. So, for example, border violence itself, trying to prevent refugees from entering a certain state or making journeys to reach safety, which involves, beatings with batons, tear gas, in some cases, refugees being shot or beaten to death. These are obviously violations of negative duties not to harm or violate the rights of people, in my view. Also with the practice of detention. So for one example, in 2017, Italy had a memorandum of understanding with Libya, which meant that any refugee trying to come from Libya across the Mediterranean Sea to Italy was intercepted and returned to detention centers on the Libyan coast, where they're then deprived of their liberty. And the conditions in these centers is appalling. Refugees are subjected to torture, sexual violence, enslavement, and so forth. Also, there's practices of forced encampments where refugees are forcibly enclosed into camps which deny their free movement. And again, there are extensive human rights violations within these camp settings where refugees are forced into them, particularly sexual violence against women and children. And another practice is the forcible containment of refugees, which is where states block off routes to seek safety in northern territories, and so contain refugees in certain regions where they face extreme poverty and further extensive human rights violations. So I think all of these practices constitute doing harm to refugees and as such engage in negative duty.
So I can imagine three different cases of people who seek refuge. So you can imagine the traditional definition of a refugee, so someone who's being persecuted by their state on the grounds of some immutable characteristic like their race or their religion. So if I think about Jews fleeing Nazi Germany who are persecuted because they are Jews, they sought refuge in various countries, and many times those countries took measures to limit the number of Jews that they would accept. Or when the boats arrived on America's shores or the UK shores or South Africa's shores, they were sent back to their deaths. Then you can have a case of a person who seeks refuge for a different reason, but an extreme reason. So there's a war that's broken out in their society, which if they remain in that territory, there's a strong likelihood that they will die. So you can imagine people in Ukraine, who are being attacked by Russians, who seek refuge in a neighboring country. You could imagine people who seek refuge for an environmental disaster. There's an earthquake, there's a tsunami, and they need assistance. And then the third case might be someone who just wants to make a better life for themselves. So the situation in their country is dire, that there are very few opportunities, that the state's, let's say, economic policies are terrible. And so in order to feed their families, they want to be able to migrate to another country, and they can, lead a life of relative prosperity in comparison. So we think about these three different categories of people. Do states have, or should states have, different obligations towards them? What is the extent of that obligation? So you can imagine saying, you're in a temporary state of crisis, and we're going to try and protect you for that limited period of time. So the earthquake has gone off. There's going to need to be some kind of rebuilding, or the fire currently rages. So during the time the fire rages, you're welcome to stay here. But after the event is over, you need to go back home. In the case where there's persecution, you might say, well, at the point at which the persecution ends in your home state, well, then you should go home. If it doesn't, then, you need to be an ongoing refugee. In the case of the economic migrants, the state might say, well, we have people in our country who, struggle to find jobs, and that you might very well displace them. And there'll often be a sense in which there's a trade-off between the poor in a society and the refugee. It might be to the benefit of others in that society. So they might say, well, we like having a variety of people move over. They start new businesses, or they make excellent employees. They're willing to work for lower wages. And so some people in society will benefit, while others will be pushed out, and you can have all sorts of inter-ethnic tensions because of it. So should the policies be different? And what do you think the limits are in terms of accommodation for these different groups?
So the first is the different types of refugees. So you're right, there'll be different types of refugees who flee for or are forcibly displaced for different reasons, whether that be persecution or war or conflict or environmental catastrophe and so forth. So in the book, I define refugees as those people who are forcibly displaced, that is, forced to flee their states of origin, as their own state is unwilling or unable to protect them from threats to their lives, human rights, or basic needs. So that includes the variety of causes of displacements that you alluded to. So, for example, persecution, war and conflict, and also environmental disaster. And so I think whether there's different responses to these different categories of refugees will, depend on the nature of the harms that they've been subjected to. But what I suggest in the book is that what's significant about refugees is they're subjected to human rights violations, both in the causes of their displacement. So if you look at the typical causes of displacement, the states that produce the most refugees, it's human rights violations such as torture, rape and sexual violence, ethnic cleansing, genocide, targeted bombing of civilians, persecution, cruel and degrading treatment, and so forth. And also, once refugees are displaced, they're by no means safe from these human rights violations. Instead, they're displaced in conditions where they're subjected to further human rights violations, either by residing in camps in areas in the global south or in urban areas, where again they face exploitation, sexual violence, torture, and also on the journeys to reach safety to the global north. So they're going to be subjected to these violations. And so what I suggest is that state responses to refugees need to take this into account. So the fact of these human rights violations. And so why might this be significant? Well, a human rights violation involves certain distinctive harms. So it involves a violation of one's autonomy, disruption of one's ability to control one's own life. It involves a violation of dignity, having a dignified existence, and it involves a violation of one's moral worth. And also, the nature of being a refugee means that one lacks human rights protection. So as a result, your human rights are acutely vulnerable to continued violation. And so you lack the ability to enjoy your rights, your most basic moral entitlements against torture, cruel and degrading treatment, and so forth. So again, states need to take this into account and provide human rights protection such that refugees are able to enjoy their human rights. And I think that's going to apply to all those categories of refugees. So I think there will be different harms and injustices that different categories of refugees and different individuals will experience, but generally this subjection to human rights violations and the vulnerability of their human rights is a common feature, which is really important to take into consideration when thinking about states' obligations.
So it seems that on the one hand, you want to say that there's a rights violation that those seeking refuge face in their home country, and that creates an obligation on a state to accommodate them. And so the question is, well, does a state have a primary obligation to its own citizens to protect their interests? And those interests could be undermined through an influx of new people in many ways. One is that there are only so many resources that are available in terms of housing, medical resources, job opportunities, and that by introducing an influx of additional people, you might very well make it very difficult for the most vulnerable within your own society, while I'm accepting that it might be to the net benefit of other people. Maybe, as I say, foreigners who come in, stir up commerce, and your GDP goes up, but a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs. And then, of course, there's going to be this claim that a state has an obligation to maintain a certain kind of cultural integrity. That if you're Italian, you can say, it's important when people come to Italy that they speak Italian, that they abide by our long history of values, and that when we have people who don't speak Italian or don't abide by our values or find our values antithetical, it creates a sense of tension, and that's something that must be put on the scales. And so I wonder how you do that valuation.
So you're right that it's widely accepted that a state has legitimate interests in controlling admissions onto its territory. It's also widely accepted that the state was justified in giving partiality to the interests of its own citizens over those of outsiders. So agent relative permissions to give priority to the interests of its own citizens. So first of all, the empirical claim that refugees would necessarily impose like an economic or cultural cost, I think is open to disputes. As you alluded to already, refugees by and large make a net contribution economically, particularly to advanced capitalist economies with an aging population. Refugees can add a lot to GDP, for example. And also the cultural costs as well. I think this claim is subject to disagreement. So refugees can and do integrate successfully with the domestic cultures of a particular country. And the extent to which they do integrate is evidentially dependent on domestic policy regarding integration programs, language programs, and so forth. And so refugees can make enormous cultural contributions as well. So like take the UK as an example. The inventor of the Mini was a refugee. The inventor of fish and chips was Jewish refugees in the 17th century and so forth. So they make significant cultural contributions. But setting that aside, supposing that they do impose these economic and cultural costs, well, we first of all might wonder whether the avoidance of these economic and cultural costs is sufficient to justify the harmful practices the states use against refugees, right? So we might wonder whether the fact that there might be some loss in GDP or there might be they might have different culture is sufficient to justify forcing them into camps or detention centers or containing them in regions where they face extensive human rights violations. So even if you grant that the state is justified to give priority to the interests of its own citizens, now this priority can't plausibly be absolute. And to claim that, well, these relatively from an objective standpoint, less urgent interests of the citizens of the state are more morally important than the urgent interests of refugees to avoid violations such as rape and torture would be to extend agent relative permissions to an implausible extreme, which I think would be inconsistent with respecting the moral worth of refugees. So I don't think those permissions can extend that far. So I don't think then these cultural and economic considerations can override the negative duty not to violate the rights or harm refugees. But in terms of the positive duties, so states, I argue, have positive duties to protect and aid refugees, right? But how strong are these obligations, and to what extent, what are states required to do in order to fulfill them? So I grant that states are required to give priority to the interests of their own citizens over those of outsiders. So you have some philosophers who propose a complete impartial consideration of interest. So we have to weigh the citizen's interest versus the refugee's interest. So this is the stance of Peter and Renard Singer, for example, and they say, we weigh the interests equally, and so we need to open borders until the point of marginal utility, which will be the point of societal collapse. Now, I think that doesn't grant scope for justified partiality, so we should reject that proposal. But nonetheless, I agree with Peter and Renata Singer that obligations to refugees are particularly strong. So many theorists say we only have obligations to help refugees if we can do so at little cost to ourselves. But I suggest that duties towards refugees are far stronger than this. They're not duties that can be so easily defeated by little cost. And I think this proposal of only aiding refugees at little cost is quite vague and allows states to deem any cost as more than a little and thereby avoid their obligations. So what I suggest is that states are obligated to protect and aid refugees unless by doing so they will undermine the capacity to uphold the human rights of their own citizens. And so the rationale behind this idea is that, well, the obligation to protect and aid refugees stems from the harms and injustices that refugees have been subjected to in virtue of the human rights violations they've been subjected to. So if a state, in protecting and aiding refugees, undermines its own capacity to uphold the human rights of its own citizens, then it risks replicating those very harms and injustices that in aiding refugees it's seeking to alleviate in the first instance. So this is stronger than a duty to only help refugees if you can do so at little cost. And I think economic and cultural interests are insufficient to override the strength of this positive duty to protect and aid refugees. Having said that, if the state in protecting and aiding refugees, if that would entail an immense impact on state infrastructure, for example, to provide welfare or healthcare or job opportunities for its citizens, and thereby undermine citizens' capabilities to enjoy those human rights, then such costs are not required. However, as I try and explain in the conclusion of the book, where I go through certain practical implications, taking in refugees is unlikely to ever have these immense costs in states.
Okay, so I'd like to give you two objections. So the one is an objection to your view on not causing harm, or the obligation towards negative duties, or obligation of negative duties towards refugees. And the other one's about positive duties. Okay, so I'd like to understand whether you think it's okay for a person to place an electrified fence around their property. I take it that if someone were to try and trespass, get into your property, they'll be harmed. That to me seems very similar, a very similar analogy to a country placing a strong border around its boundary. If that's not similar, if there's a disanalogy, I'd like to understand what it is. Okay, so that's the objection to having a strong border. The second objection is towards positive duties, it concerns the positive duties you say that states have towards refugees. If a state has positive duties towards refugees, if it has to shell out money to help refugees, that money doesn't come out of the ether. It comes out of taxpayers' pockets. And any given taxpayer could say, hold on a moment, why am I obligated to pay for a Syrian refugee's education? I don't understand that. Why is that my obligation? It seems like my taxpayer money, which I assumed was going towards the betterment of my society, is now being spent on people outside of my society, and that's not within the mandate of the government that I've elected, and it's not something I want. I think if you were to ask that question to taxpayers, whether they want their money to pay for a Syrian refugee's education, I think the answer would almost unanimously be no. So it seems like, yes, you're helping the Syrian refugee, but only by violating the rights of the taxpayers.
Okay, some great objections there. Okay, so let's take the first one. So the idea is you've got your property and you build electric fence. Would that be permissible? I guess it kind of depends why you're doing it and who it affects, right? So I guess I would suggest that there's a disanalogy between that and what states are doing in preventing refugees from escaping. So one, you might think that a state putting up a border that prevents refugees from arriving in that state thereby confines refugees to a certain harmful situation in which they face extreme poverty and human rights violations. So in what you're doing in putting up this fence is you're denying an escape from a harmful sequence. Now, if I deny your escape from a harmful sequence, I'm doing harm to you, right? So if I block the fire escape of a burning building such that people cannot escape from it, I'm harming them. And what I'm doing seems intuitively to be deeply morally wrong. If I block the hole in a partially frozen lake where someone's swimming underneath such that they drown, in denying their escape from this harmful sequence, it seems like I'm doing something very deeply morally wrong and I'm harming them. So if you putting up a fence means that someone is unable to escape a threat to their life, then I think what you're doing is impermissible because, well, first of all, I think what you're doing is doing harm. And then there's a further question of whether it's justified or not, right? Because it's not always impermissible to harm other people, but you are harming that person by denying them from escape from a harmful sequence. So I think that's one important point here. So if someone was trying to get onto your property to escape some attacker and you put up this electrified fence and, to add insult to injury, you threw stones at them or something like that, I think what you're doing is constitutes doing harm. Now, whether it's justified or not, I think states doing that to refugees seeking safety is not justified. Well, one, because I think the harm to refugees that obtain as a result of these border practices is unnecessary. There are alternative means available with which states can support refugees in regions close to their states of origin, which discourage onward migratory routes. I also think the harm caused is disproportionate, vastly disproportionate relative to the potential imposition of refugees entering the state. So consider a group of refugees entering a state versus the harm that results from current practices, which includes immense physical, mental suffering, human rights violations, and so forth. The harm caused them is grossly disproportionate. And also, I think this is very important. Refugees are not morally responsible for the imposition, insofar as, of course, they're agentially responsible for seeking safety, but they're not morally responsible for the imposition. Insofar they have no reasonable alternative apart from to seek safety. The alternative is to face extreme human rights violations and so forth. So though they may arguably impose on states, they're not morally responsible for that imposition, and therefore they're not liable to be harmed. And so I think those considerations mean that blocking refugees' escape from these harmful situations is impermissible. So that's my view on that. To turn to the positive duties to help refugees. So if I remember rightly, you said that, this involves citizens paying money, right? And we don't have a duty to do that, and maybe it's a violation of the right. Well, I guess we may have a disagreement about the existence of positive duties here then. So I take it as established that there exist positive duties to help persons if you can do so at little cost. So the standard thought experiment that everyone's familiar with is Peter Singer's drowning child in the pond case, where we're asked to imagine that you're walking through the park and you see a small child drowning in the pond. Now, you could easily help this child by putting them to safety, but this would ruin your best clothes, let's suppose, cost you £200, $200, whatever have you. Now, most people will think, well, of course you should still save the child. £200 spending that cost is morally insignificant compared to saving the life of an innocent child. So therefore, even though I have to pay some money, sacrifice some interest, that's morally insignificant compared to saving the life of a child. So therefore, I have a positive moral duty to save people from severe harm if I can do so at little cost to oneself. So if you accept that, we do in some instances have positive duties, then it's no violation of your right to act in accordance with those duties.
Okay, so I'd like to follow up on both of these. The blocking the fire escape is a very interesting analogy. So I take it that if that is the correct analogy for what's happening, then I agree with you. You should not block the fire escape in a burning building. I think you've done something wrong. The question is whether that's what's happening when you close a border to refugees. So maybe one of the assumptions that you're making is that that's the only way out of the building. And this is an assumption that the media often makes. So, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the arguments used is that Israel has disallowed Gazans exit from their country. There's no way that Gazans can pass in or out of Gaza or from their territory. But this is just false. There's other countries that border Gaza as well. There are multiple fire escapes. So the question is, why do I have to keep this one open? Why is it my duty? And this leads to a larger problem, which is I think you might be confusing wrongs and wrongdoers. So you say that the state that blocks access to refugees is a wrongdoer as well, because in blocking they cause harm. But there is an initial harm that caused the refugee crisis in the first place. It was the state of the refugee that performed the greatest harm. And now you're saying that other states are obligated to fix it, right? Other states have to step in and allow access to refugees. This is a very quick move. That's a very quick move. It's confusing two wrongdoers and two harms. So there's the initial wrongdoer, the initial state that harmed the refugee or the would-become refugee. And then there's the state that blocks access. Those seem like two very different harms and two very different levels of wrongdoing. And I think what you're doing is you're saying there's one event that's happening here. You're describing it as a single event. There is this humanitarian crisis. There is this violation of human rights that's happened, and we need to stop that from happening as the state that can do so at little cost. That seems like an error in description. So you're describing the event as a whole, as a problem, and then this state that's blocking access is part of the problem, and so they shouldn't do that. They're doing something very bad by blocking access. But if you were to describe the situation differently, as two different wrongs with two different wrongdoers, you've got the initial much worse wrong of the state that housed the refugee initially having failed in its duties in an abominable way, right? So there's abominable things that, for example, Syria did. That means that now it's failed in its duties in an abominable way. That abomination doesn't transfer over to any other state that isn't allowing access. So there's this mix-up. There's this conflation of two different events into one, and then allocating wrongdoing based on that conflation rather than on the much lower evil performed by the state that's not permitting access.
If I can take that latter point first, I think you're absolutely right. So if a repressive state is repressing its population, and this causes refugee displacement. Sorry, you might hear a siren going by. So if that causes a refugee displacement, that's of course a serious moral wrong and a harm that I don't dispute that at all. But sadly, it is the case in non-ideal circumstances that we live in a world in which there are these repressive regimes which cause refugee displacements. I don't think it follows that just because someone else harm someone that we now have no duties towards them whatsoever. It's someone else's responsibility. But following that, I think that is the primary wrong. I think you're right about that. But it doesn't mean that states are therefore acting permissibly when they then block escape routes, right? both things can be wrong and harmful, right? So going back to the burning building case, right? Suppose some villain set the building on fire, right? It doesn't mean it's now permissible, or at least not harmful or not wrongful, for me to block the fire escape on account that, well, someone else caused the fire, right? So, and me blocking the fire exit, now that's a lesser wrong and a lesser harm than initially setting the building on fire. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's still harmful and it's still wrongful in my view. So I think the fact that there's an initial wrong doesn't mean that states closing their borders and preventing escape from harmful sequences is thereby not wrongful at all. Now, going back to your earlier point about my argument kind of assuming that, well, we're blocking the only means of escape in states enacting these border policies. They're blocking the only means of escape for refugees. And you were kind of contesting that maybe that's not true. If there are numerous states that the refugee can go to, and one state says, no, you're not coming in here, then they haven't necessarily denied escape from a harmful sequence, because there's other possible avenues for the refugee to go to. So there might be an argument that you're still doing something wrong by denying entrance to your state, but I think I would have to concede you're not denying an escape from a harmful sequence, quite simply because that's not the fact of the matter. There are still other means of escaping. The trouble is, these containment practices that I analyze in the book do block the only means of escape for a number of refugees to escape appalling conditions. So, for example, the Libya arrangement with the EU blocks that main migratory route to safety from North Africa to Europe. The EU-Turkey deal blocks that migratory route from Middle Eastern states into Europe. So they do, in fact, block the only means of escape to northern states. So they are, in fact, one of these instances of blocking the only means of escape from a harmful sequence. And insofar as they are doing that, they are doing harm to those refugees.
But that's not clear, right? So if we take your line seriously, so if we buy into your position, any country could fly a bunch of planes into a given area where that's war-torn and producing refugees and rescue them and take them home. Routes do not have to involve land movements of masses of people. And if you say, well, that's not plausible, I'd say, well, just have a read. What we need to do is read your book. Give your book to states, and you think that they have these very strong obligations to rescue these people at great expense. So they should fly out these jets, collect them, and bring them home. Now, this is not outlandish. This has happened. So Israel has done this, by the way, in the past. Other states have done this. During COVID times, countries repatriated citizens at enormous cost. This is not unheard of. Why do you think there's only one exit? We have air travel. Literally any country in the world is a possible exit point.
You're absolutely right. So there are these potential avenues for refugees to find safety. Trouble is, they just are not operative at the moment at all. Like less than 1% of the world's refugees are actively resettled by northern states, and which is the means you refer to as actively going into the regions, identifying refugees in need of resettlement, and then flying them over to Canada, the US, UK, what have you. So that is not a route that's available to the vast majority of 99% of refugees. That route is not available to them, right? So also, repatriation is back to their states of origin is not a realistic option given the protracted nature of a number of these displacements. So realistically, the only option that the vast majority of refugees have to access safety in northern states is to set foot on those territories. They can't just get on a plane because you need a visa to be able to do that and so forth. And states will punish and sanction airlines who let people on the airplanes without a visa. They don't issue visas to people from these states. So the only realistic option they have is to set foot on northern states' territories. And that's a terrible situation because it incentivizes these very dangerous journeys in which many people lose their lives. And so, as I suggest in the book, I agree with you. There are these alternative means. For example, humanitarian visas, expanding resettlement, providing safe and regular routes. Humanitarian visas are visas issued to refugees that, after initial asylum eligibility assessment, and then they can use these visas as valid documentation on commercial airlines, and just fly safely to safety. Now, this might sound like pie in the sky, no state would ever do this, but we did it for Ukrainian refugees. So you could apply online for a visa, be issued a visa, and then board any old airplane, or even Eurostar was providing free train journeys for Ukrainian refugees. So these means are available, and as I argue in the book, we have strong obligations to provide these means. The trouble is, people haven't read the book yet, and so these avenues are not readily available for the vast majority of refugees. So unfortunately, it is the case that in blocking these migratory routes to safety, you are literally denying escape from these harmful sequences.
So I want to test the analogy with blocking the fire escape. So if you've got the burning building and you go and wall off the fire escape, and those that are inside their own building, they'll perish, it seems like you've done something wrong. Seems different, though, from saying there's a burning building and I'm going to lock my door, and so are my 1,000 neighbors. Now, in that situation where you've got people who are now in need, they've lost their housing and would like some free housing elsewhere, I would think that you've done a very good thing if you open up your home and you say, you've lost your house, come on board, I'm going to look after you. Seems different to saying that you have an absolute obligation, and by locking your door, you have done something incredibly immoral. It also seems like if you think there is an obligation, that obligation is diffuse. It's to all the neighbors who have locked their door, and maybe you think that you've got some kind of positive obligation to assist, and you might think that someone who says, "Well, look, I'm keeping my house locked, but I'm going to go out and I'm going to operate a sort of little soup kitchen in the public street," then you've met your obligation. Well, you've even gone beyond your obligation. I don't know many people think that they have a very strong obligation to say, well, there's 1,000 people who don't have homes, and there's 1,000 homes, so I must take one person into my own home. I think even that would be seen as very strong. I also think there's something interesting about this claim that the northern states have a special obligation. So you mentioned that the Europeans have now blocked their border to the Syrians. Now, of course, one could go east instead of west, right? That if you're a Syrian, you could go and resettle in Saudi Arabia. You could go and settle in India. That's, if you keep going east, there are many countries that are quite hospitable, wonderful places to live. But if you look at, for example, Japan's policy on foreigners, the view is pretty much, if you're not Japanese, you're not welcome. And we hear almost nothing in critique of the Japanese model. The Japanese will say, it's very important for us to ensure who lives within our borders. We have an accelerated crisis in terms of age. There's a sort of V structure in Japan where you've got lots of elderly people and a few young people. So it might even be to their benefit, to get lots of youngsters to come on board. But they've said no. We are Japan for Japanese people. We're not taking in South Koreans. We're not taking in Thai people. We're not taking Vietnamese. We're not taking anyone from the West. We don't want you speaking, English too much in our country. It's important that we keep our historical values here. No one's giving them a hard time about it. Now, I can buy a case where you say your country is the country that caused the crisis. So, for example, if you engage in a war in a place and you're the one who displaced all the citizens and burned their stuff down, you might think, well, now you've got an obligation to help out. It's not so obvious to me, though, that the Portuguese, did anything in Syria that creates an obligation on Portuguese citizens. And as I say, when we're dealing with a situation where you've got, let's say, everyone has some diffuse obligation, why a greater obligation to the West as opposed to the East?
So I really like your case of the burning building, but you've got surrounding houses and so forth. So I think what I'd want to emphasize is that if this is going to be analogous to the situation of refugees and the burning building is the state of origin, well, once you fled the burning building, you're in very dangerous territory, right? Because you no longer have a state. And that's a very serious situation to be in because there's no human rights protection. You're going to be subjected to various forms of abuses and so forth. So you kind of almost out the frying pan into the fire, right? And so in that case, Yeah, I do think the houses collectively would have an obligation to save them from this harm. But I would push back a little bit on the analogy between your own home and a state, because I think there are important differences here. So, well, if you let someone into your home, you have to like intimately associate them with them for like prolonged periods of time. There's going to be a significant cost to you personally. So I think our intuitions are kind of sort of led astray there. Whereas accepting a group of refugees into a state is not really like that. You're not having to intimately and personally associate with people on a prolonged period of time. It's not going to affect your self-determination or your life prospects in any significant way. So I would push back a little bit on the house and state analogy. But I think even in the house case, yes, they have responsibilities to help those who are in desperate need in front of them. And even if other states or houses in this case are not performing their duty, I don't think that negates your duty. It doesn't seem permissible for me to let people suffer and die when you could easily help them at a little cost to yourself on the grounds that, well, other people are also letting them suffer and die. That doesn't sound plausible to me, but maybe some people have defended that position. Then going to the broader question of, it's not just European states. There's other states that might be able to offer protection. Yeah, I don't doubt that other states have duties towards refugees to protect and aid them. I focus mostly on northern states in the book and in this discussion, primarily because they're among the most affluent states with the capacity and resources to be able to aid and protect vast numbers of refugees if they want to do so. They also have enormous influence over the refugee regime, by which I mean the laws and institutions and norms in international relations that govern state responses to refugees. And they also explicitly avow certain normative commitments, as well as legal commitments. For example, normative commitments to like human rights, the freedom of individuals, humanitarianism, and so forth, as well as legal obligations such as the principle of asylum itself and the principle of non-refoulement. So you can appeal to these commitments and norms to try and demonstrate that certain responses are mandated by these norms and commitments, whilst others are being contravened, and so reform is needed. But yeah, I agree that these other states certainly do have obligations to refugees, and I don't know the case of Japan in much detail, but as far as my knowledge is concerned, I think they are significant contributors to the UNHCR, for example, to provide sort of regional support programs to refugees. But if it's the case that they're denying protection to refugees, then I think that would be appropriate subject of moral criticism.
Okay, I want to dig into your positive duty view. So you mentioned Peter Singer and the drowning child. It seems very plausible that you're walking along and there's a child drowning in a pond, and the cost to you to save this drowning child would be wetting your new leather shoes. And so you think to yourself, I won't do that. You carry on walking. It seems like you've done something wrong. You should have helped. Okay. Now, the problem is when you're living in a world with millions of children drowning in ponds, that once you set the precedent that I should be a bit late for my meeting, wet my shoes, and you start thinking, okay, there's a child drowning in this pond, but there's actually lots of drowning children all over the place. Once you set that precedent of saving one child, you actually now realize that stopping at one would be a mistake. You should continue doing so, and it becomes overly demanding. So the question is, how many refugees should you let in? I like the way you phrased it with Mark. If you let in a handful of refugees, it doesn't disturb the state. It doesn't disturb the way you live. Well, that's one way of characterizing the problem. And if you characterize it that way, that's fine. I think everyone would agree that if you cap it at a handful of refugees, we all agree you should let them in. The question is, once you let that handful in and another handful says they'd like to come in, do you have the same obligation? If you do have the same obligation, you've got to let the next handful in and the next handful and the next handful in until you've got many, many, many refugees. And this is not a fanciful suggestion. This is not out of the bounds of imagination. This is happening in many states where local cultures are being displaced entirely by a majority of people coming in from the outside. And I'm not a fan of culture, so I don't believe in the value of culture, but a lot of people do believe in the value of culture. And I think given that they were there first and they pay taxes and they are citizens, their interests should be weighed. So that's the first question: is where do you limit this? And it leads to just another way of expressing the point, which is a lot of people argue that letting in refugees is death by 1,000 cuts. So yes, one cut's not going to kill you, two cuts is not going to kill you, but it's going to generate an enormous strain on the society if you let in an infinite number of refugees. So I assume that you're going to hold the view that there is some limit. I assume you're going to hold that view, right? You're not going to say that we should let in an infinite number of refugees into the country till the point of collapse. I assume you're not going to take that view. So where are you going to draw the line? And I think that the person who wants to say no refugees is drawing the line at just a different point to yours. You agree that there are countervailing values if you think you should draw the line anywhere. It's just that you're valuing one set of considerations more than another. The ratio is different compared with someone who wants to close the borders entirely. But just by drawing the line somewhere, you're agreeing that there's countervailing values.
So it's not the case that there's just one drowning child. There's many. I think that's true. And I agree with you that there must be some limit. So the first thing that I would say is that, yeah, I do specify a limit, which I call the principle of human rights, which is a state is required to protect and aid refugees, unless by doing so they would undermine the capacity to uphold the human rights of their own citizens. So that's the limit, the principled limit on my view. So if taking in refugees would undermine the infrastructure like law enforcement and so forth, or healthcare provisions and there was no other means to mitigate these impacts, then states are not required to incur such costs. So yeah, I do specify that limit, which I think that principle is stronger than allowing sort of, for example, cultural interests to override the duty to refugees. I don't think if there's any cultural impact that's a violation of anyone's human rights or undermines anyone's capacity to enjoy their human rights. So if necessary, those costs would be required. I don't think they would be necessary. So that's where I kind of set the sort of principled limit. But in terms of like what the practical implications of that would be, so yes, there are many refugees. There are around 44 million refugees worldwide. And often there's a kind of alarmism about the number of refugees that it's unprecedented and it's a crisis and all the rest of it. And that's just simply not true. There's been far greater displacement figures in the past, and we've got a vast array of policy tools to alleviate it and provide protection to people. So, for example, the UNHCR identifies about 1 to 2 million refugees in need of resettlement every year. And if split between the 27 resettlement states, these are the states that typically participate in resettlement schemes like European states, Australia, and so forth, that would amount to around 50,000 refugees per year. That doesn't seem to be too substantial, and that would provide protection to around 2 million of the most vulnerable refugees in the world. And also, not all refugees would need or want to be resettled or claim asylum in northern states. You can support regional programs that provide the infrastructure in regions close to refugee states of origin. So provide for education, healthcare, human rights protection in those areas through concessional loans or grants and foreign aid and so forth. And so there are these policy tools available to address this, and I don't think it's too demanding or infeasible. I don't think it's fair to say, oh, this would be too demanding for states in the north to bear, when we simultaneously expect states in the global south to bear these responsibilities. For example, like Lebanon, which is the country the size of Wales, hosts about 1 million refugees. So I don't think the costs are too demanding or surmountable. And if we look at the response to the Ukrainian displacement as well, we've seen that these policy responses are readily available and immediately implementable. So Europe has provided protection to about 6 million Ukrainian refugees almost immediately, and they have immediate access to welfare systems, jobs, education, and so forth. The UK has taken around 250,000. And this doesn't seem to have been too demanding, and we haven't really heard any arguments about how this is too costly, how we possibly couldn't cope with these kind of things. So I think an ethical response towards refugees is not too demanding and is within our reach.
Do you think it's fair for states to engage in a screening process? We've identified that there are different people who could seek refuge, and we've put them in various degrees of need. There are also people who might have devious motives for wanting to, cross the border. So if you think about the Syrian civil war, there are going to be some people who are persecuted on the grounds of their faith, so in the traditional refugee category. Some people who are just displaced by the terror of war. Some people who would like a better lifestyle. And then some people who are themselves perpetrators. So, they are not civilians. They are people who performed acts of killing and have now worked out that they're on the losing side and they could have a much better life abroad. And maybe not even just a better life, but that it would suit them to have access to a European country so they can set up positions that are hostile to that state. So it would be naive to think that everybody who seeks refuge does so for good reasons. And it seems like states have some kind of interest in maintaining their border control. That if ISIS arrive on your border and say, well, we'd like to set up a caliphate, you have reason to say no. We don't like your values and stay out. So in order to do that evaluation, you've got to do some screening. So one, what do you think the limits are of the screening? Two, who are the kinds of people that states can legitimately keep out? And three, for those where they have good reason to grant them refuge, what's the limit in terms of time? So you might say, you've been here for 10 years, you've built up a life here, but the crisis at home is over. So we're going to deport you. Is that unfair? Do they developed a legitimate expectation that, well, I've been here for a while, I have a right to be here forever? Or do you think that there's a limit on that? And then it seems like part of what's complicated about thinking about a nation absorbing people is that different parts of that nation will bear the brunt at different times. So in America, for example, the border states will complain bitterly. If you're in Texas, you're going to say, well, we're getting a lot of people who live on border towns who are now inundated with tens of thousands of people from South America. And those in New York say, what's the problem? Why are you complaining? Be decent and hospitable because you don't have to deal with it. Good example is that I think on one of those northeastern isles where the Kennedys have their summer spot, they have signs up on their doors that say this is a place where everybody is welcome. We're a refugee-friendly spot. And so the governor of Florida said, well, let's test that principle. I'm going to send a bus through with 50 people. And they completely and utterly freaked out, and they put them on a military base. So it's very easy to say, of course you're welcome, unless I'm the one who has to, experience the costs. And so the assumption is that, well, it'll always be a diffuse cost, that everyone will just be putting in their small amount, but that might not be the case at all. It might be that certain areas are going to get a very strong impact and others will feel almost no impact at all.
Okay, yes, and really important point. So I want to take the sort of security question first. So would states be permitted to refuse entrance to someone who poses a security threat? I think, of course. Yeah, I think that's already a feature of international law. You're permitted to refuse entrance to anyone who poses a threat to national security. And I think morally that stands up. If someone is morally responsible for posing an unjust threat to you, then yeah, you don't have to accept them. So I think that's fine. I think a screening process, if necessary, to alleviate security concerns might be permissible, but subject to certain constraints, human rights constraints, and so forth. But I think I want to emphasize that it's a myth that refugees pose a security threat, and it's an old myth. Even Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany were deemed a security threat. Refugees are understandably averse to violence. There's no empirical evidence that supports a correlation between the presence of refugees and higher instances of outbreaks of civil violence or terrorism and so forth. So I think we need to be careful of that myth. But yes, if it was the case that a refugee posed a security threat, then I think it'd be permissible for the state to protect itself. Onto whether a refugee who's been accommodated within a state for a prolonged period of time, and then perhaps the conflict in their state of origin is resolved, would it be permissible to deport them? I don't analyze this kind of case in detail, but I guess as an initial assessment, it seems that, well, if you reside in a particular community, you might develop certain normatively significant relationships and claims to remain as part of that community, especially if it's been a very prolonged period of time. To be deported to a community in which you don't have those relationships would seem to be very harmful. So I think there'd be strong moral reason not to do that, and force people against their will, for example, to do that. So that would be my view. But again, I haven't thought carefully enough about it in detail to be able to offer a firm position on that. I think your point is about like the different impacts on different communities within a state is really important. And I think state governments do have a responsibility to distribute the responsibilities of refugee protection fairly among different communities within a state. And so that can be done in consultation with local authorities to assess like integrative capacities, and also with like an impact fund to provide additional resources to certain communities that might be experiencing a higher influx of people compared to other communities. I think these are very important things to do, and all the evidence to suggest that providing this additional investment to support the infrastructure in these communities benefits the communities themselves as well as the refugees, and it's just a win-win for everyone. So I think you're right. It is incumbent on states to think carefully about how they distribute the responsibilities.
So I want to push back on your view that it's not that big an imposition to allow refugees into the state. So you give this setup or system where you would distribute refugees sort of equally among various northern states, and you say there'd roughly be 50,000 a year. It's not too much. But earlier, you said we should really pay great attention to what's actually happening in the world, which is that you don't have this system. And now let's look at the obligations of a given state, given that other states are not just welcoming an equal number of refugees. So suppose 1 million refugees arrives on your doorstep and you're a northern state. Should you let them in? Now, we can't say, well, you should let in 50,000 because the other states should each let in 50,000. They're not letting them in. So the question is, do you let in the 1 million or not? On your view, I take it that the answer is yes. Why? Because it does not violate the limits that you set, which is it does not involve a human rights violation to the local population. What will happen? Well, there could be economic collapse to a point. There would be job losses for the locals. There would be a housing shortage. There'd be strain on the medical apparatus. That's all okay because it doesn't involve human rights violations. I take it that's much too low a bar, that if people were to think about that case seriously, they would say, whoa, hold on. The fact that my human rights are not being violated is not sufficient. You're destroying my way of life. You're really undermining my quality of life. That's significant enough an imposition. So I agree that if you were to set the bar higher, there might be some sort of plausibility to the position. But that's a really low bar, that my human rights are not being violated as a local.
If protecting and aiding refugees would undermine the state's capacity to uphold the rights of its own citizens, including rights to education, employment, healthcare, and so forth, then those costs are not required. So if the intake of refugees would entail like collapse of these systems or such that citizens were not able to find employment or access healthcare or anything, then of course such costs are not required. And so short of that, it's not clear to me what the significant impact on people's lives would be.
So let's push that. Okay, so you're including in human rights the right to a job, to employment, which, by the way, just seems very strong. But let's agree to that. I think you've made your position weak by doing that. I don't think you need to make that move. But if you do make that move, then you should accept no refugees at all, because it could always be the case that even one refugee could take up the job of a local person.
So I think an additional person in competition for a job does not constitute a violation of your right to employment at all. So long as you're still able to seek and gain employment, whether that be that particular job or not, you still have a human right. So I don't think that's being violated at all. So I don't think it's that strong.
So you're saying that even if my job is given to a refugee, no right has been violated because I could have applied for that job. I could have gotten the job if I was the better employee, potential employee. I could have gotten that job. Well, then I go back to my original case. You let 1 million refugees in. It just so happens that they compete for jobs and they win out some of the time, and that a whole bunch of locals no longer have jobs. It seems again like you have given too much over to refugees.
So as long as citizens are still able to gain employment, which pays them wages, I don't think there's any human rights violation there whatsoever. So yeah, I don't think additional people competing for jobs such that it's more competitive is necessarily a human rights violation. I mean, we don't tend to think that that's the case in normal cases. Like if a new generation comes of working age and there's additional competition for jobs, we don't think my rights being violated by me being in competition with these other people.
I agree with you, but we think that something bad has happened. It's not a human rights violation, but we think something bad has happened. And I think the locals are allowed to say, that is a bad thing that will happen. It doesn't violate my human rights, but that is a bad thing. I don't want that to happen, so I don't want these refugees to enter the economy.
Great. So they might have an interest in just saying, we don't want these refugees here to just integrate into the economy. I have some interest in them not coming. I guess what I argue about is these interests are just morally outweighed by the moral imperative to protect and aid refugees, to prevent the immense harms and injustice that they're subjected to as a result of their displacement. So you might have certain interests, but they are constrained by moral duties, right? So, you know, a state and its citizens might decide, oh, they want to like invade other states or enslave foreign populations or deny healthcare to the elderly or something like that. Well, they're not permitted to do these, even if it might be in their interest, because these interests are already constrained in the prior instance by moral obligations. So if, as I've argued, there are moral obligations to protect and aid refugees, well, even if you have an interest in not doing that, that's overridden by the duty to protect and aid refugees. So yeah, I think that interest is insufficiently morally significant to justify refusing entrance to those who would otherwise be severely harmed. And also, you know, to go to a more practical example, you started the question with this case of, well, suppose 1 million refugees turned up on your doorstep. Are states obligated to admit them? And I say yes, as long as it doesn't undermine their capacity to protect and uphold the rights of their own citizens. And in fact, many countries have done this. So Germany took in approximately 1 million refugees between 2015 and 16, and a further 1 million refugees over the last 2 years from Ukraine. And we haven't seen massive job losses and all these kind of impacts that are typically invoked to justify refusing entrance to people in need. So I think such costs are morally required given the strength of duties to refugees.
I suppose Jason's point is that there's an ambiguity in things like quality of life and interests and human rights. And that, you know, we can keep adding people and sort of saying, fine, interests are being eroded at some juncture, up until the point at which you think that there's a total collapse or a rights violation. So if you have a right to a healthcare system, the question is, what's the quality of that system? You know, you might think, well, it's a world-class, unbelievable system, and we can kind of erode that down to some mysterious point, you know, where we say, okay, anything beyond that would be unacceptable. We can have, let's say you have 20 kids in a school and they have an wonderful access to education. We say, well, we can push that up to 45. Once we start to get to 50, maybe then we're starting to violate some rights. You know, there's going to be ambiguous territory, but it sounds like the cost that could be absorbed by citizens could be spectacularly high if the threshold set is human rights violation. And I suppose that's the concern, is that you've got a lot of interests on the one side of the scale that we can basically brush off on the grounds that you've got a right trump on the grounds of the refugees. And that may well be the right calculation, but I think it's worth just confronting it. It, of course, could be the case that the refugees are going to do lots of good. They're going to start new businesses. They're going to enrich your cultural experience. They're going to invent new things. If you think about many of the German Jews who are refugees who went to America, Albert Einstein being one of them, it was incredibly good for the long-term prosperity of America. They managed to get many people to become citizens who would have been great assets in their own countries. And the Americans capitalized on that and, became one of the world superpowers. So, of course, you've got to look at both sides of the ledger. But Bradley, I want to say it's been an absolutely fabulous conversation. And we wish you all the best with your book, and we hope that it gets widely read. And we'd love to hear from you, the viewers. What are your thoughts on the rights of refugees and the obligations of states?